Hey everyone, welcome back to the Chilling Room. Tonight I'm about to take you on a journey through love, shadows, obsession, and the unsettling space between the living and the dead. This isn't just a ghost story. This is a warning, so dim your lights, put on your headphones, and prepare yourself for the haunted vow. The final exam paper slammed shut, marking the official end of their junior year. For Mark, Sarah, and David, it was more than just a semester wrap. It was the prelude to an escape, a calculated departure from the sanitized comfort of Crestwood University. Their destination, the Blackwood Mountains, a range infamous among local hikers for its breathtaking isolation and its unsettling, persistent silence. David, ever the practical organizer, was behind the wheel of his beaten-up '98 Ford Ranger, its suspension groaning under the weight of their camping gear. Sarah, glued to the passenger window, watched the familiar suburbs dissolve into pine forests, a nervous excitement tightening her chest. Mark, the group's resident skeptic and amateur historian, navigated, occasionally reading snippets aloud from an old yellowed map. The old local name for this area, Mark read, tapping a spot marked Raven's Watch, was Umbra Fossa, the Shadow Pit. Legend claims it was the site of ancient pre-Christian rites. They say the air itself holds memory. Stop reading creepy folklore, Mark, Sarah chided, though her voice lacked conviction. We're going for peace and quiet, not a seance. But as they ascended the narrow, winding mountain road, the atmosphere began to shift. The warm, golden hues of late May vanished, replaced by a sudden, bone-deep chill. The trees, mostly gnarled, ancient hemlocks, pressed close to the road, their dark canopy blotting out the afternoon sun. The vibrant sounds of the forest floor, the chirping insects and rustling leaves, simply ceased. All that remained was the low, steady rumble of the truck and the strange silence between them. They finally pulled into a small, barely visible clearing. It was a bowl-shaped depression beneath the towering, jagged peak of Raven's Watch. The first thing they noticed was the stones. Not random boulders, but a geometrically precise circle of weathered, moss-covered granite pillars, half buried in the damp earth near the tree line. They seemed less like natural formations and more like forgotten sentinels, guarding a secret. Well, that's certainly atmospheric, David muttered, turning off the ignition. The sudden quiet was deafening. They worked quickly, setting up their tents in a rudimentary fire pit. As the sun dipped, casting long skeletal shadows from the trees, Mark felt an inexplicable pressure on his chest, a sensation of being intensely scrutinized. He kept glancing toward the stone circle, convinced he saw movement in the peripheral darkness. That evening, the campfire proved little comfort. The flames struggled, casting a weak, flickering orange glow that barely pushed back the encroaching blackness. Mark tried to play a familiar tune on his guitar, but his fingers kept stumbling, and the melody sounded thin and mournful in the vast expanse. "David, you're unusually quiet," Sarah observed, wrapping her arms around her knees. "You okay?" David looked up, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Yeah, fine. It's just, you feel that? The air. It feels heavy, like a deep breath caught in someone's lungs. It's waiting." They eventually retreated into their tents, the cold seeping into their sleeping bags. Mark lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the deep woods, the snap of a far-off twig, the rustle of an unseen creature. But beneath these natural sounds, he heard something else. It was a sound so low it vibrated in his bones before he consciously registered it with his ears. A drone. A deep, resonant hum that seemed to originate from beneath the earth itself. Slowly, meticulously, the hum resolved into a rhythm, a repetitive, syncopated chanting. It wasn't English, or Latin, or any language Mark recognized. It was guttural, raw, yet chillingly musical, like liturgical recitation sung through gritted teeth. It seemed to come from the direction of the stone circle. Mark reached for his flashlight, his heart pounding a frantic counterpoint to the drone. He quietly unzipped his tent flap and peered out. The stone circle was illuminated by a faint, sickly green luminescence, and standing among the pillars were silhouettes. They were tall, impossibly thin figures, swaying gently to the rhythm of the chant. They didn't seem to be wearing clothes. Their forms were simply patches of deeper blackness against the ambient gloom. Mark froze, paralyzed by a terror that clamped his lungs. He wanted to scream for Sarah and David, but the sound caught in his throat. He looked toward David's tent. It was slightly ajar. David was gone. A cold certainty washed over Mark. David hadn't been taken. He had walked out. Mark silently crawled out of his tent and ran to Sarah's. A frantic whisper was all he could manage. "Sarah, David's gone. I saw things by the stones, shadows. We need to go." Sarah was awake instantly, her face pale in the light of his phone. "David, where would he go?" As if in answer, a sound pierced the chanting, a single drawn-out shriek of pure, unadulterated agony that echoed off the peak of Raven's Watch. It was David. Ignoring the paralyzing fear, Mark and Sarah grabbed their strongest flashlights and sprinted toward the sound, crashing through the brush and scrambling up the rocky incline. The chanting grew exponentially louder as they neared the summit, now vibrating with raw, manic energy. They burst onto a small, elevated plateau, revealing a sight that shattered the last remnants of their sanity. David was lying in the center of a much larger, more elaborate stone ring. Unlike the circle below, these stones were sharp, jagged, and marked with symbols that seemed to writhe in the flashlight beam. Fresh carvings had been made on the central altar stone, slick with a dark, glistening fluid. David was convulsing violently, his body arching off the cold stone. A tall, cloaked figure stood over him, its back to them. Its cloak was the color of dried blood, and it held a bone-white blade that glinted wickedly. "David!" Sarah screamed, running forward. The cloaked figure turned. It wasn't human. Beneath the hood, its face was a void, a smooth, featureless surface marred only by 2 points of light that burned like molten silver. It spoke, but the voice wasn't in the air. It was in their minds, cold and sharp as the mountain wind. The covenant must be fulfilled, the blood debt collected. As the entity began to move, David's eyes snapped open. They were no longer the soft hazel they knew. They were solid, terrifying black. A deep, impossible bass voice erupted from David's throat, a voice that carried the weight of ages and the promise of endless suffering. It was the same chant they had heard from the valley, but now it was issuing from their friend. "Kathar Ishath, Thar Malak, Thar Yog Sothoth." The ground trembled. The air grew impossibly cold, then suddenly sweltering, carrying the overpowering stench of sulfur and burnt meat. The stones around them began to glow fiercely, etching the strange symbols into the night air in brilliant, toxic green. Mark fumbled desperately in his jacket pocket. He found the small, tarnished silver crucifix his deeply religious grandmother had insisted he carry. Driven by a desperate, illogical instinct, he yanked it out and thrust it toward the cloaked figure. A sound like tearing silk ripped through the air. The figure shrieked, a sound of frustrated malice, and staggered back, its smooth face rippling violently. The silver cross seemed to burn the air between them. "Sarah! The center! We have to get him off the stone!" Mark yelled over the roaring sound of the wind. They both lunged, grabbing David's flailing arms. As they pulled, David's body went limp, then impossibly heavy. They were too late. The air above the altar stone shimmered, then cracked like a pane of dark glass. A swirling vortex of shadow and electric green lightning tore open. The chanting, now multiplied 1,000-fold, seemed to pour from this nascent rift. From the swirling chaos, a form began to coalesce. It was huge, dwarfing the cloaked figure. It rose on massive, cloven feet, its hide the color of obsidian, draped in shadow. Great curled horns spiraled back from its crown, and its eyes, twin pits of infernal flame, fixed directly on Mark and Sarah. This was not a ghost or a petty demon. This was a prime malignancy, summoned by the ancient black rites of the Shadow Pit. This was the entity Mark had read about, the Lord of the Blackwood Covenant, now fully manifest. A psychic scream assaulted Mark's mind, a terrible voice of infinite power promising endless torment. He felt his will breaking, his sanity shredding. Sarah screamed David's name as their friend, now a silent, empty shell, was drawn upward by an invisible force, his body dissolving into wisps of shadow as he crossed the threshold of the rift. He was gone, consumed, the ritual complete. The monstrous entity roared, a sound that shook the very foundations of the mountain, and took a single slow step toward the surviving students. Its power was tangible, crushing, suffocating. "Run, Mark, don't stop!" Sarah screamed, shoving him hard down the rocky slope. They scrambled blindly, deafened by the entity's chilling, triumphant laughter that seemed to peel paint off the world. They didn't look back. They ran until their lungs burned, until their legs failed, until they tumbled out of the darkness and onto the main dirt road, miles away from the clearing. They drove until the sun rose, until the horrifying green light was replaced by the familiar, cleansing yellow of morning. They never stopped running. They never spoke of the stones, the chant, or the sight of the entity's flaming eyes. But they carried the covenant with them. Every cold silence, every shadow in the corner of a room, and every time the wind made a low, unfamiliar drone, they knew. They knew the price of the shadow pit had been paid, and they knew the mountains were always waiting for the final installment.